Hey TechKnowStuds! In this lesson, we're going to cover that vulnerability management and what it looks like from a really high level. So let's just jump into it. We're going to kick this lesson off going over different definitions. Then we're going to get into risk management versus vulnerability management. What I like to do is get a perspective on what the differences are between these two because it really helps define what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Then I'm going to get into vulnerability management process and what it looks like. We'll talk about the vulnerability lifecycle, a lifecycle of a vulnerability, and then we'll talk about scans and pen testing. First of all, an asset is just something that has value to us. So we're going to use the example of data. Let's say we're storing some sort of data and it has a value to us as a company. Well, that data has threats against it. It could be stolen, it could be altered, it could be deleted. Think the CIA triad here: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. A threat agent or actor would be an entity or a person that would carry out the threat. So whatever is the perpetrator essentially is whoever is stealing, altering, or deleting this data. Risk is a calculation of the probability something could happen times the impact. If this data were to be stolen, so a breach in confidentiality by this threat right here, first of all, what is the impact going to be to the company? Also, what is the probability that this would happen? And then that gives us a measurement of the risk that there is to the company. Mitigation is something that we do to reduce risk. So we either have to reduce the probability or reduce the impact. For instance, if this is our data, maybe we're putting walls up, maybe we're putting a gate up. And so now we're mitigating the risk, we're reducing the probability that it's going to get stolen, not the impact because we haven't changed the data itself in this example, but we've reduced the probability that this data is going to get stolen, and so now we've reduced the risk. Vulnerability is a weakness. For instance, we've got a hole in this gate right here, a gate that's broken. And so that's a vulnerability of that gate. An exploitation is when our threat agent exploits that vulnerability to get a hold of this data in this example, or get a hold of whatever asset it is. Now, this is a model that you might see on some cybersecurity sites, and I mostly agree with this model. It's at least good to have a discussion around this. Now, what does it mean? Well, we have an asset. That's the data right there. There is a threat to that data. For instance, it could be stolen. And there's a vulnerability. We have a break in the gate. And right there is where our risk lies. I say I mostly agree with this because I do find that risk sometimes falls outside of this circle right here. And some of it has to do with how you define a vulnerability. And different people define vulnerabilities a little differently. And so what I mean by that is my area where I live is not susceptible to tornadoes. It's very rare that we would have a tornado. We just don't have the conditions right to have a tornado. And so I wouldn't say that the area is vulnerable to it. I may have a data center here. Now, so would I say that I have a vulnerability to the tornado? And I would answer no. But is there a risk there? There's still a risk that a tornado could happen here. In fact, I have seen it twice before in living in this area. We've actually have had a tornado and it's caused a little bit of damage. Not a lot of damage, but a little bit of damage. So I suppose it could happen to a degree that could cause some damage. So there is a risk there. I wouldn't really say we had a vulnerability to it, but some might argue that in fact, well, you have had it, and so you would be vulnerable to tornadoes. And so it just defines how you interpret what a vulnerability is. Let me give you a little different aspect of these two different definitions of vulnerability. Right here, we have a break in the gate, and that is a vulnerability. Everybody would define this as a vulnerability. And what somebody could do is they could exploit this break in the gate to gain access to whatever asset is behind the gate. And so what we would want to do is identify that vulnerability and then fix that vulnerability. However, some would have a broader definition of vulnerability and say, well, it also is vulnerable to tank attacks. And that's not really what we're identifying when it comes to vulnerability management. This is what we're identifying right here from a vulnerability standpoint. And if we're concerned about tank attacks, I would label that as more the risk side of things, that we would identify it in the risk management and try to combat that from a risk management perspective. From a vulnerability management perspective, we're trying to identify these flaws that are within, maybe it's software, maybe it's hardware, maybe it's some sort of physical control that we have in place, and identify those flaws and fix those flaws. So let's get a little deeper into this risk management versus vulnerability management. When I think of risk management, we do something like a risk assessment to identify risks to the company as a whole, the business. What are business concerns? And we're taking a look at that big picture. When we're looking at vulnerability management, we're going to do things like vulnerability scans and pen testing. We're going to look at information sources. We're going to look at maybe having some sort of discovery or disclosure program, and we're going to get more in depth into that later on. We'll do things like patch management to fix these flaws that we have within our system. So this is more of like technical weaknesses that we have in there. When it comes to risk management, it could be a really, not necessarily, but they're generally larger projects to fix these risks and mitigate these risks. Versus vulnerability management, we're looking at more simple to maybe more complex, but more simple fixes in there. I definitely have had some projects that have been would fall under vulnerability management. From a risk mitigation standpoint and risk management standpoint, we might transfer the risk, accept the risk, avoid the risk, or mitigate the risk. These all are applicable to vulnerability management as well, but generally speaking, I find the two things that we really do from a vulnerability management is we either remediate it, meaning fix it, we do away with it, make it so it's not a vulnerability anymore, or we recategorize it. And I'm going to get more in depth into that in another lesson as well. So examples of this is, from a risk management standpoint, maybe we're concerned for the business sake about competition stepping in and overtaking us, reducing our profits, reducing our revenue. Perhaps though with our vulnerability management, we're looking at more like, what does a SQL injection attack look like? Because a lot of software, this is a flaw. And so we're identifying those flaws and fixing those flaws. So here's really the vulnerability management process and what it looks like. Very similar, I'd say, to what a risk management process looks like, but we're looking at it from a little different scope. We are using different tool sets, although I will say that we do, as part of risk management, is vulnerability management. Or what if I'm doing a risk assessment, I bring in some vulnerability scans and that type of thing into the risk assessment, but it's only a small component of risk assessment. So what we have with vulnerability management process is we start out with the discovery. We discover what are the flaws on our network, what is the vulnerabilities we have on the network, and then we assess those. And based off of our assessment, we're going to prioritize the importance of what we should be tackled and what we should fix. And then we plan to fix those, create some sort of plan, we remediate those, and then at the end here, we verify that we fixed this. And this is something that we continuously do on our networks. Through the whole process here, we could be pulling reports. There are certain key areas that I find that we do pull reports on, but we could really pull reports anytime during this process. So this is the reporting aspect of it all. Now that's the management process, but we also have a vulnerability lifecycle. And specifically, we're talking about like software vulnerabilities or protocol vulnerabilities. And so what this looks like is there's a beginning, middle, and end to a lot of these vulnerabilities. So what we have here at the beginning is what's called 0 day. 0 day because the developers have had zero time to fix the issue. So let me give you an example. Let's say we're a software company and we've just rolled out an update to our software, but we didn't realize that it had this major flaw that could be devastating to us, to our customers, to the data that's being stored in the system. And so we rolled it out not realizing that there's a flaw. So we've had 0 days to react to this. Now, at some point in time, there's probably going to be this flaw is going to be discovered. Maybe it's discovered by us. Maybe it's discovered by somebody we've hired to discover it. Maybe it's discovered by one of our customers. Maybe it's discovered by a hacker, but it's going to be discovered. And so now there's a concern here, because not only do we have this flaw, but it's a known flaw, something that could get out and people take advantage of it. And so, especially if it's a hacker, they might want to take advantage of this flaw. Now, what happens is that gets put on our common vulnerabilities and exposure list. So there's a list out there of all these common vulnerabilities and exposures. And so this information will be logged on there as this is something that is out there. Now, this is a big concern because now it's public knowledge. So really, this step isn't just CVE, but it's just anywhere where this is broadcasted out and publicly announced. And now we have a big problem because anybody can look at that, and a lot of people get notified that this is a new vulnerability, and now hackers are trying to take advantage of this to exploit it for whatever purpose that they are trying to do it for. So us as a company, we're panicked now and trying to get a fix out there before this vulnerability is exploited and some hacker takes advantage of it. So we create a patch to fix this vulnerability and make it go away. And then it gets deployed. And deployed might happen, if we're a software as a service company, we could just deploy it and fix it. But in the cases like, let's say it's a Windows machine or a Linux machine or something with the operating system, that we're going to have to, rely on all the companies out there to deploy this fix to their systems that are out there. And so the real risk here comes into play between when it's discovered. It gets heightened when it gets publicly acknowledged out there to the point where we deploy a fix to it. So this is a real danger zone for us and for our customers and for wherever the scenario is. This is the danger zone that we really need to watch out for. So throughout the process, for instance, let's go back to our example of we are a software company developing this software. We're going to want to do a lot of self-assessment and make sure that things are secure and that our systems are not vulnerable. But the problem is we're the ones developing it. So we could have blinders on. Are we really looking at everything correctly? Are we experts in our career, in our field? And since we're working on the product, do we already have certain leanings one way or another with certain vulnerabilities and the way we construct things and stuff? So really, getting a third party, some other vendor, somebody else out there doing oops, that says self-assessment, but doing an assessment for us, a third party assessment for us, somebody else coming in and looking at our systems and doing an evaluation is going to be an important part of this all. Now, vulnerability scans could be that we just have some sort of software that we're running on our network and it's discovering issues that we have on our network, vulnerabilities that we have on our network. So this would be a fast way to understand, do we have vulnerabilities on our network? If we wanted to take it to the next step though, we may do some sort of penetration testing. So beyond just having some sort of software that does a scan of our network, now we have somebody that's actually trying to hack our network, that's going in there and trying to figure out where are these vulnerabilities on our network. And so a lot of times we hire a third party to do this penetration testing, or what we call pen testing for short, to be able to really evaluate our network and see if there's any vulnerabilities or problems on it.